Yeah, this one. That's the better call. All right. It's a great pleasure to introduce Terry Sejnowski, who will give the first talk of today's the workshop. I will keep it short. There is a lot to say about Terry's work, but I'll keep it short. Terry is a professor at the Salk Institute and UCSD, and he has done a lot of early foundational work on neural representations, neural networks, and methods such as independent components analysis, or in particular for the visual system. He is actually also one of the founders of NeurIPS, originally NIPS conference, which has been extremely influential in forming, as you all know, in forming sort of modern machine learning. And he is the president, he has been the president of the board for the NeurIPS Foundation for the last 30 years, since 1993. So we'll looking forward to hearing his thoughts on the remarkable recent developments in AI and the connections to the brain. Let's welcome Terry.
So the last time I was here was 10 years ago, and there was a similar workshop, and it was the early days of deep learning. A lot of excitement. Well, I'm here again, and now the big deal now is transformers. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But actually, the focus of the talk is going to be on temporal context. And temporal context is really important in language because words are ambiguous. And the only way you're going to figure the meaning of the word is by looking at other words around it. And in some cases, previous sentences. For example, the word this in a sentence may refer to nouns in the previous sentence, right? Now, I'm also going to talk, so I'm going to talk about temporal context, but I'm also going to talk about long-term working memory. So what's working memory? So, in neuroscience, the way it's studied is by, you record from neurons in a monkey, and then you ask the monkey to do a task, and a light goes on, it's fixating, and it goes off for a few seconds, and now the monkey has to remember where to move to get the reward, right? So that, in that case, working memory is a few seconds. But let me give you another example of what's called in psychology long-term working memory. So you're listening to me, one word after the next, and you're going to continue listening to words for the next 40 minutes, and one slide after the next, right? And at the end of the talk, you're going to ask a question, I hope. And it somehow integrates all that information that you've taken in. You can even say on the early slide, the graph there had, was rising in a certain way. And how could you remember all of that, right? That's what psychologists call long-term working memory. And I'm going to get back to that at the very end. Let me tell you, though, in the case of short-term working memory, we know a lot about the mechanism. We know there are neurons in different parts of the cortex that are active during the delay period. So it's an activity-based mechanism. But no one knows what the mechanism is for something that lasts for hours. And by the way, all of that detail goes away the next day. You might remember a few things, maybe a joke or two, and maybe something you attended that was particularly interesting. So this is a temporary kind of a memory, but it has a time scale which is different from the traditional way that we train neural networks. We have two phases. We put an enormous amount of effort and a lot of data into training up the network at the very beginning. Then we use it for inference, which is very fast, right? And those are two time scales, very, at the very beginning, at the very end. But in the brain, there are many time scales in between. And that's really what I want to explore. What can we learn about this long-term working memory by looking inside of brains? Okay, so let me give you some examples. I just told you about audio, one word after the next. When you're reading a book, just think about it. What are you doing? You're saccading from point to point across the page. taking in snapshots, and somehow you're extracting meaning from those saccades and integrating them so that at the end of the sentence, at the end of the paragraph, at the end of the chapter, you have built up a long-term working memory of what you have just read, right? That's very similar, except now it's visual instead of auditory. And the same thing with videos, right? Videos are sequences of images, and they're continuous, and they build up a story, and it may be accompanied by words and so forth. How does the brain do that? Well, let's take a look at language translation. So in the old days, and by that I mean 10 years ago, recurrent neural networks were used for language translation. And here's how they worked. The words would come in one at a time, and here's a recurrent network, and these are time steps. And the words would go in, they'd get embedded, then they would go into this recurrent network, very large recurrent network with a lot of connections between the units. And then there's a queue, and then it's trained on many, many sentences to go from, say, English to French, right? And again, it would go one step at a time, and it would spit out one word at a time, right, after the go queue. Now, here's the problem with the recurrent network is that the first word comes in, and its trace exponentially decays. So by the time you get to the end of the sentence, there may not be a lot left there. There are kludges you can use like LSTM, which will hold on to information for the entire sentence. And it worked. I mean, it really worked. But transformers do a much better job. Surprisingly good job. And how do they work? Well, okay, here's the architecture of the transformer, and they're feed-forward networks. You put in your query here, feed-forward. It goes into this loop here. It's been trained on many, many, many sentences to predict the next word in the sentence, right? Self-supervised. And that's really important. But somehow, after being trained up, it's able now to answer new questions. It generalizes in amazing ways. And that's what this whole workshop is about. How does it do that? Well, first of all, we know what the mechanism is here for long-term working memory. Every word that comes out gets put into the long input vector, and it just keeps getting longer and longer and longer, including every word that you in the query during the dialogue. And so it has access to everything that was said during that session, right? But it has another mechanism, which is equally important, which is called the multi-headed attention. And here's what one of those blocks look like. There are a stack of these blocks. Here it is. And what it is, it's a matrix that tells you the weight, the associative weight between words in the sentence or words in the long input vector. It could extend over sentences and paragraphs. In fact, the whole, so it's a very big matrix, huge matrix. And it's trained just as well as the feed-forward weights. It's also trained. Now, something I want to point out, which is, it's hard to see here because they make it look as if the multi-headed attention goes between the input and the next layer. But you see there's a bypass here. So it's actually in parallel with the feed-forward flow. So it's added. It's kind of, it's added here and normalized. And so therefore, it's really very interesting. It's doing something that is very important and maybe essential. It's the magic sauce. And it's a matrix. So recently, someone at Stanford, Christopher Wray, does anybody here know him? He's an engineer, electrical engineer. You know him? Okay. Okay, well, I heard him give a talk at the NeurIPS meeting a year ago, and he gave a talk about this. He replaced the self-attention matrix with a state space model. So you can see here's the self-attention pathway, and here's the direct bypass, and they're combined. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mamba. What is a state space model? First of all, state space model is very commonly used in control theory, in signal processing, Kalman filters, and so forth. And the idea is you have a state, X, you have a matrix, which is the model of whatever it is that you think your control system is trying to do. And the input comes in, U, And these matrices, and the output comes out Y. So there are a bunch of weights here. There's a matrix A, there's input weights and output weights. So it's linear, and a lot is known. It's completely analyzed. We have complete knowledge, and there's a huge amount of literature on the state space model. And how did it work? How is it that it was able to solve the same kind of a problem that the association matrix had? Well, first, just to give you some results, this now is from a series of different Mamba. This is now Albert Gu, his student, that range in size from 130 million weights up to 2.8 billion weights across a wide range of tasks. And the only thing you have to know here is that Mamba, the best score is bolded, and Mamba wins just about hands down against self-attention, right? So that's pretty amazing that it can replace self-attention. So what exactly is going on in the state space model? Well, first of all, it's not an arbitrary matrix. The A matrix for these models, state space models, turns out to be, have a following structure, has the same value along the main diagonal, the same value along each diagonal. That's called a tuplets matrix. And it has some really interesting properties. First of all, it does the equivalent of a temporal convolution. You can use it, for example, for doing Fourier analysis. There's a huge literature on it. And I'm going to show you that it does something else that is even more amazing. Here's a simple tuplets matrix. There's only one row here. Everything else is zero. And so what good is that? I mean, that seems like a really lame matrix, right? Well, it turns out that this is for a system that you'll see in a minute that is equivalent to supporting a traveling wave across the activity patterns that in the model. And here's the model. And this is the equivalent differential equation. That's a traveling wave equation, first order. Okay, so here it now is some simulations that were done by Andy Keller, who's a former student of Max Welling, and it's a collaborative work that came out. It's actually, I think it's been accepted in ICML. And we're comparing two different initializations, okay? If you start with the tuplets, the one I showed you in the last slide, you get beautiful traveling waves across time. This is the one-dimensional system where you have all the units in the recurrent network lined up. And you can see that there's a very nice progression at a given velocity. But if you start with small random numbers, which everybody does when they do these models and try to train them, you get nothing but looks like random kind of activity patterns. Now, let's see if we can do some computing with traveling waves. Okay, so here's a very simple task called the copy task. The idea is you give it a sequence of one hot inputs, and then at some point in time, you give it a go signal, and you have to repeat it on the output. So you have to remember it. Okay. And furthermore, you can vary the time interval, 10 steps, 30 steps, or hundreds of steps if you want. And we're going to compare the wave recurrent network that I just showed you, starting with this very simple tuplets matrix and with the randomly initialized matrix. So first of all, you see that the wave network can remember it perfectly for many, many time steps, okay? Whereas the even recurrent neuron, even after a lot of training, is struggling even just to remember it. And then, you know, it just loses it completely if you wait too long. This is exponential decay. Now, here is even more amazing. This is the learning curve, mean square error. This is a log scale. You can see there's a tremendously fast learning process that occurs that reduces the error by 8 orders of magnitude after 600 time steps of learning. And that's true for intervals lasting for 30 time steps or 80 or even several hundred time steps. These traveling wave networks love sequences. They can remember sequences. Very, very good at not just remembering the sequence, but manipulating the sequence. Here's a somewhat more difficult problem. It's given a sequence of inputs now, they're numbers. 25, 32, 8, so forth. And every once in a while, there's a signal that says, remember this number and add it to a counter. Okay, so it has to remember and to know when to add, and it has to be able to add, and it has to remember the total. Okay, so here, as yes.
To be this copy forward.
Oh, you start with that's the initial condition, and then you tweak the weights. This is backprop through time, right?
And then to break some symmetries, you also introduce some small perturbations, or you have to
No, just the training data. It'll perturb the weights in that matrix a little bit, just so that it does a task, whatever the task is that you want it to do.
So you took one of these state space models and you just modified the initialization to be this.
That's right. The only difference is the initial condition. That's the only difference between these two, and you can see the actual performance is really quite remarkable. So here, for example, with 100 numbers that came in, the performance, well, first of all, you can see is practically perfect, very fast learning. Eventually the randomized network eventually catches up with 100. It does the task, thank God. But it's slower and slower as you get to 400 or 1,000. It just poops out completely. Just can't do it. Yes.
So isn't that it's half the line that you start with? That's something that, like in the good old days of neural networks.
Listen, the good old days of computers had Mercury delay lines. That was that way that they had memory. Yes, yes. This is like a tap delay line. It is. It is. It's a network that implements a tap delay line. Yes. We trained it that way.
You aware of the or know of the eigenspectrum of the recurrent matrix in these state space models? I was recently reading.
Yeah, they're orthonormal. Yeah, that's important. Okay, now so what does this have to do with the brain? Okay, you may ask. Well, so in the early days of recording in the last century, almost everything that we know about the properties of neurons came by recording from one neuron at a time with a microelectrode. Okay, now it's not too surprising. Nobody discovered traveling waves, right? You can't. You have to have at least 2 electrodes at 2 locations. Okay, well, now we know that every place you look, and also what they discovered though with one electrode was that there are these oscillations in the brain ranging in frequency from, with different frequency bands from, like 2 hertz all the way up to 100 hertz. And each frequency band was related to some behavior, right, of some sort, including sleep. And so there are local waves, like within V1, I'm going to show you that in the next slide. And then there are broader waves that go across cortical areas. And then finally, during sleep, for example, there are global waves that go across the whole cortex. These are mysteries. And now I did a review paper. There are 100 papers in the literature showing that there are these traveling waves using all sorts of tools and techniques in every cortical area. And unfortunately, we don't know what they're there for. Why are they there? Okay, well, it's hard to, if you don't know the function of something, it's really hard to make progress. Okay, so I've already given you a hint for what they might be good for, right? They might be good for computing. Okay, so here's some data. This is from Mark Snitcher's lab at Stanford. This is an optical recording, wide field across all of V1. And you can see that there's a traveling wave that goes across the field. This is 3 millisecond delays there between these 2 shots. And there's another one here. And you can see that if you have recordings at different locations, that the peak travels. But you also see something really important is that it's not a sine wave. It's not like it keeps going forever. It's a packet that only lasts for about 100 milliseconds. And this is in what's called the gamma range, which is 30 to 80 hertz. So this is interesting because the gamma range has something to do with attention. I'll come back to that. Okay, now this is something that came out of my lab, and this is recordings from the cortex. Yes, question?
What is the scale and what exactly are we seeing there? Is that a bunch of...
Oh, okay, yeah, so okay. Okay, what are we looking at? Okay, I would give you the background. No. Okay, so this is during sleep, and this is called the sleep spindle. And this is what it looks like when you record from the EEG on the outside of the scalp. And it lasts for 1 to 2 seconds. It's about 10 to 14 hertz. It's found in all species of mammals. And here now is an array of electrodes that's put on the surface of the cortex in somebody that has epileptic seizures. And the purpose is, these are drug-resistant cases, and the purpose is to locate the focus of the seizure. Where did it start? And if you have that, if you could take it out, maybe it'll help. In some cases, it does. But what you're going to see now is that this is false colored from +1, white is +1, and black is -1. So you're going to see a pattern of activity that has to do with something going on during sleep. And this, by the way, thousands of spindles during the night. And these spindles have been associated with what's called memory consolidation. They'll say consolidating experiences you've had during the day into your long-term memory. Okay, so if you just follow the white dots around, this patient just woke up. No, here we go. Okay, so you can see it goes from the temporal lobe to the parietal lobe to the prefrontal. It's like this. This is a side view. We call them Princess Leia waves. Some of you you probably remember Star Trek, right? Okay. So this is amazing. This is amazing. No one ever, I collaborated with someone who studied these sleep spindles for 30 years, and he thought they were synchronous. And everybody in the field thought they were synchronous until we got these results from the human. Now, what's the connectivity like in the cortex that could support these traveling waves? Well, it turns out to be a Mexican hat. If you look at the activity, the connections between nearby neurons are excitatory, say within a millimeter, but then if you look a little bit further, they're inhibitory. So this is what the matrix looks like. This is a cross-section shown here. And what's interesting is that this forms what's called a line attractor. What's a line attractor? Well, you've heard of Hopfield point attractors, and that converges to a single activity pattern. This actually will go down to an activity pattern along this neutral line. It's a line attractor. And what happens, though, is that if there's any kind of imbalance or input, it can be shoved across, and that will correspond to a traveling wave. So here's a model. I'm not going to go into the details. This is implementing a Mexican hat. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like. Now, this is integrate and fire neurons, so they spike, and there are about 100,000 in this ring model. Beautiful traveling waves, and they're going in both directions because it's symmetric. And they're sparse. It turns out that only a few of the neurons are active when it goes by, which means you can have 2 waves going through each other. And by the way, epileptic waves are dense. All of the neurons are active when the wave goes through, and then there's a big depression afterwards, right? So this is, and by the way, we can't get this out of small networks with a few hundred or a few thousand model neurons. You need at least 100,000. So it's a scaling issue here. Now, if you do a Fourier analysis, you get 1/f², just like you do in the cortex. The Fourier analysis in space and time gives you the velocity. It turns out to be, in the cortex, it turns out to be 0.1 meter per second, which is the speed of unmyelinated axons, which are known in the cortex to extend laterally over many millimeters, long-range horizontal connections. So this may be the substrate for the waves that we see in the cortex, which travel at 0.1 meter per second. Now, it's not just the cortex. It turns out the hippocampus has these waves too. So let me show you an array. This is from Sejnowski at Caltech. He put an array of electrodes in the hippocampus, dorsal ventral. And again, people have known about these theta waves. They're 4 to 8 hertz for, I was going to say centuries, at least since the last century. And it was always thought to be synchronous across the hippocampus, but it's not. So again, it's false colored, but you can see the traveling wave going across the dorsal ventral. So that's interesting. Now, hippocampus is really interesting because it's at the very top of the apex of all the sensory input coming in, including the prefrontal cortex. And it's known that when a rodent walks across a track, that there are specific neurons in the hippocampus that will activate. This is one neuron activating at a particular location, color coded here. And these are called place fields. Interesting. But it turns out when the rat goes to sleep, it replays. There's a forward replay at about 6 times the speed, and this replay goes into the cortex, right? It's feedbacks into the cortex, part of this process of memory consolidation. It also goes backwards, which is kind of strange, and no one really understood that. So I'm going to briefly give you a synopsis of a paper that was published in October from my lab. A hippocampus is a generative recurrent network. And so here's the hippocampus. Input comes in from the entorhinal cortex. There's an input layer, and then this is a very highly recurrent network called CA3, and then there's an output area called CA1 that goes back to the entorhinal cortex. I wanted to point out something really important here. This pathway here is the famous trisynaptic arc, but there's a direct pathway from the entorhinal cortex to CA1. So CA1 gets 2 inputs, one from CA3, one from CA1. Let's go quickly through this. So CA3, we think, stores sequences. And we used an autoencoder, but it's a different kind of autoencoder because it has a recurrent network in the hidden layer, and it's trained not to predict the input, but the next input, right? So it's the loss function is trying to help it predict and learn sequences. After we trained it up with backprop through time, and we reordered the units, what did we find? Mexican hat. Mexican hat. It discovered a Mexican hat, which means that it's supporting traveling ways after a lot of training. And in fact, if you can store more than one pattern sequence, because it's sparse. You know, this is very small fraction of all the units you're seeing here. This is the weight of the neighboring units here is excitatory and then inhibitory flank. So here's the Mexican hat. Okay, yes.
Both the architecture that you used for this and how you trained.
Oh, okay, yeah. The training. Okay, let me show you. Okay, here's the training. We gave it a sequence of frames in 9 movies. Okay, and it's trying to predict the next frame. That's the input. That's the training. It's a lot like the transformer, self-supervised, right? It's nothing's labeled. It's just trying to predict what's going to happen next, right? And each one of them is doing a different action, has different clothing, and so forth. And the question is, we trained it up. We got all 9 sequences into the network. We could replay each one of them by giving it the first frame, and it will replay all the next the movie. It will replay the movie. So we analyzed it with ICA, independent component analysis, that Misha mentioned earlier. And lo and behold, if you look at the activity, this is the ICs of the activity patterns during each of these movies, they really are isolated in subspaces, right? This is projected down now, dimensionality reduction, which is interesting because it organized the network in such a way that it could separate out the different patterns that it has to memorize. Now, it can do more than that, just memorizing. It can also learn invariances. So this is a case where instead of giving it, this is MNIST digits, giving it one sequence, of many different inputs, we just basically gave it a bunch of sequence of a rotating pattern. In this case, a 0, in this case, a 1, right? And it was able to reproduce that here. You give it a 0 and it will rotate it for you. You look inside the network, and interestingly, for digit 1, as it rotates, as the output comes out, the activity pattern rotates, and for each of the digits in different locations. By the way, everybody says these neural networks are black boxes. Why do they say that? It's because they've never looked inside. And we did. I mean, you can analyze it. You have access to every single unit, every single weight, every single activity pattern. Why don't you just take a look and see what's in it? Right? Yes.
You know, how well it would learn the sequence?
No.
And why not?
Because we were interested in the hippocampus here. But you're right. If we were doing a machine learning paper, we would have compared it with other methods. By the way, it also generalizes. If you can give it new digits that it never saw before, it will rotate them too. So that's good. It learned the invariance of what rotation is all about. Now, to get this published, we had one reviewer who was adamant that the brain doesn't use backprop through time. Hard-nosed neuroscientists, right? Show me how it could be learned with totally local learning algorithms. So we reached back to a learning algorithm that was developed by Jeff Hinton and Jay McClellan back in 1988 called recirculation. And it was a very simple network architecture that had two layers, an input layer and a hidden layer. And the input, and this is actually trained with random noise, but the input layer would bounce back and forth. The input would bounce back and forth between the input layer and the hidden layer. The hidden layer was not connected together, right? And it turns out these two learning algorithms, you compare y at one time point with y in the future, and this is a very simple Hebbian update rule for that, the v weights and the u weights, and it turns out they converge to be the pseudo inverse of each other, which is interesting. And it's in both u and v going up and down. Now, this never really worked very well for memorizing sequences. And so an undergraduate in my lab, a math major, realized that what's missing is another learning algorithm for the recurrent weights. So she found a learning algorithm for these weights in the recurrent network that was able now to learn sequences. So this shows it's a proof of principle. We haven't scaled this up yet, but it's a proof of principle that the brain might actually be able to solve this problem without backprop through time. Now, Mia Cameron, my undergraduate, went away for the summer and she came back and said, Terry, I've generalized this to feed-forward networks. I said, wow, that would be amazing because maybe you could do that for the visual cortex and the auditory cortex. Maybe this is a general principle, right? And so here's her algorithm. I'm not going to go into any detail. It's in our neuron paper, but you train the weights going up the way you normally would, but then you have to train these backward weights. You can't just use the transpose the way that you do in backprop. And so what she did was she found an algorithm, and this is really digging deep into the literature on pseudo inverses. Turns out there's a local algorithm for computing pseudo inverse. So what happens is you twiddle the W weights, the W3 weights going up, and now what you do is you do some. You can either do it offline or online. You then twiddle the red weights in order to be able to approach the pseudo inverse, and that's done separately on each layer, and it works. So here is two small data sets, MNIST and CFAR, which are toy data sets by today's standards, but just to compare. So backprop here is the dashed line. This is the test loss, and the reciprocal matrix is the red one. That's the one that I showed you. And then we used an alignment alignment algorithm that Tim Lillicrap created. You just have random weights going back, and it also is able to solve that problem. It's an easy problem, but it takes longer. And also on CFAR 10, right? The red one, it's more efficient, put it that way, than doing something randomly. We haven't scaled it up yet, but this is very promising, and we think that this could help us understand how brain can learn things in a layered structure without using gradient descent. It's an alternative to gradient descent. Okay, now I'm going to run through this just very quickly, just to say that we can get some temporal context just from the fact that when inputs come in, just like throwing a pebble in the pond, there are these waves, and they form interference patterns. But if you know about holograms, you know that this is fine. All the information is still there. It's just been scrambled. And so this lets the idea of what I call a space-time neural representation. So here we have a neuron that's going to spike. It gets inputs from many different sources across the cortex at different time delays. And so this is like a space-time cone. So this spike is going to be affected by both the direct sensory input, but also by the local connections within the cortex. And this goes back to physics, right? Which is relativity. And furthermore, let's say in V1, that time interval might be 100 milliseconds, but as you climb the hierarchy up to the infratemporal cortex, two things happen. First of all, the time interval gets longer and longer, so maybe seconds or maybe even longer. In the infratemporal cortex, by the time it gets to the prefrontal cortex, it can actually be, it gets more abstract as you go up. So we know infratemporal cortex, you can recognize objects in all different orientations, so it can figure out invariance. But by the time you get to the the prefrontal cortex, it's a very high level representations. So there's conceptual generalization going on as you go up this ladder. Now, I'm going to come back now to long-term working memory. I started with that, and I told you that there is no known mechanism in the brain to account for it. And I'm going to show you that there actually is, but no one has yet connected the dots. So I want to take you back to a very influential paper that was published in 1997. Bert Sakmann is a Nobel Prize winner. Henry Markham is famous for the Human Brain Project, if you would know anything about that. But this is a beautiful experiment. It was done in a slice, 2 pyramidal cells close to each other and connected with synapses as shown by these colored dots. And now here's the experiment. What you do is you stimulate the input to one neuron, the sensory input, which is it's called the excitatory postsynaptic potential. So you can see that it's stimulated here. It goes up a few millivolts. And then secondly, you can actually inject current into that very same postsynaptic cell and get an action potential, which goes up the dendrite. Okay, so here's what they did. They paired pre, before, post at different frequencies. And here shown at 20 hertz, you can see that the pre, before, post elevates literally within a few seconds, it elevates the strength by 20%. It maintains it over about an hour. However, if you reverse it, if you give the post spike before the pre-synaptic and pair that at 20 hertz, you depress by about 20%. So this is interesting. They call this long-term potentiation, long-term depression. Here, long means about an hour. Now, what if we vary the frequency of pairing? Well, it turns out that if it's less than 10 hertz, nothing happens. 2 hertz, 5 hertz, nothing happens until you get above 10 hertz. So with 10 hertz, you can increase it by 20%. And then as you increase the frequency, here's gamma up here, 40 hertz, you can increase it by over 50%. Now, this is very interesting, and it was thought to be a mechanism for long-term memory. Long-term meaning days, weeks, hours, years, right? However, one of the things they showed that is buried in the paper that everybody has ignored is the fact that it depends, the length of time depends on how much of a buzz you give it. If you just give it a small buzz, it will elevate just like here, but then it will come back in 20 minutes. That's called the induction phase. If you buzz it a little bit more, a few more, another bout of pairing, it may last for an hour. And as you buzz it more and more, it lasts longer and longer, right? And so people, of course, in the slice, you never go more than a few hours, so you don't really know. But it seems to me this is a candidate for long-term working memory, right? In other words, here's what might be going on. And this is purely speculative. Is it a coincidence that these traveling waves have frequency bands that are in the same range for this called short-term synaptic plasticity? So here, by the way, is a graph of a lot of data from the hippocampus. It's not just the cortex, where you can see with pre, before, post, and you get LTP. Time window is about 10 milliseconds, plus or minus 10 milliseconds. So it's really precise timing, right? So is it a coincidence that this frequency range for STDP, spike time dependent plasticity, is that a coincidence, or is it a mechanism that could be used for temporarily elevating the synapse strengths of a bunch of cortical neurons? Now, the beauty of this mechanism is that it's temporary, right? It's not going to last forever, may not even last beyond a few hours if it's only during the induction phase, but all we need is a few hours, right? We don't need all of it, we don't all of it to go to long-term memory. We just want what you attend to. And it turns out that attention is associated with the 40 hertz gamma. When you pay attention, it's more likely you can remember it the next day after sleep. Okay, now this is interesting. So it turns out, what are the synapses? Well, we know there are two classes of synapses in the cortex. About 10% are very large and very strong, and they're very stable. They will last your lifetime. And then there's 90% that are very small, very labile. In fact, not only do they change their strength pretty rapidly, but new ones are being created all the time and old ones are being pruned, right? This is a perfect substrate. 90% of the synapses in your brain could be there for temporarily holding on to my lecture. That's a lot of synapses. You're basically commandeering the whole brain. And I think that's a tier on top of the fast sensory motor pathways that have been very well studied when an animal has to reach for something. That is only a few seconds. We're talking about a tier that is way longer, has much longer time scale, and could be used, as I showed you in our very simple simulations of recurrent networks, for holding on to information, sequential information, and manipulating it, computationally. Now, here's something that I'm not the first person to notice this, but Dan Feldman, actually, who's here, was the one who told me about this. This is really interesting. So if you remember the diagram of the hippocampus, the input comes in from the cortex to the dentate, which is, it turns out, small cells that are very sparsely activated. It turns out the input from the thalamus, say in the visual cortex, comes into layer 4, small cells, sparsely activated. That goes up to layer 2-3, which is very highly recurrent, just like CA3. This projects down to CA1, which is the output. This projects back to the cortex, other parts of the cortex. And interestingly, the input also from the thalamus converges onto the 2-3. So we have exactly the same thing for predictive autoencoder, the same circuit. And this suggests that what's going on in the cortex is a stacked predictive autoencoder. Right? And this can be tested. Everything that I've told you about is something that for which there are experimental tests. So let me just summarize predictions. Okay, cortical layers are homologous to areas of the hippocampus, and so we have a model that might help us give some intuition. The connectivity matrix in the cortex is not a one-dimensional attractor, line attractor. It's a two-dimensional sheet attractor, which gives it more computational capabilities. The space-time code I was telling you about is very interesting, and it's very counterintuitive because it mixes space and time together. At a single moment in time, it's representing the past inputs. And this is the big one, waves in the cortex encode temporal context. This is the function we've been waiting for. Why are these waves all over the place? Temporal context and synaptic plasticity. This expands as we go up the hierarchy and gets to the high conceptual level. And now we're not talking about what is the object, but concepts that are abstract. And finally, and this is the big one, if this works, this is going to tell us a lot about cognitive behavior, our ability to think, maybe even to, who knows, what things that we're aware of. That waves induce spike time dependent plasticity that is used for long-term working memory. And there's a theory of consciousness called the global workspace. Bernie Bars came up with this, and it's probably the leading theory right now amongst neuroscientists. And it states that all the parts of the cortex are representing different things, but somehow you have to have some way for them to communicate with each other globally. And it's a workspace. So it turns out that by activating patterns of activity in all the synapses globally and integrating them the way that Bernie Bars has thought about, might serve as a substrate. Now, this is even more speculative, right? but it actually has the right time scale, and we'll see. It's testable. Okay, well, finally, as I said, the global workspace. These are the collaborators and students. Yu-Si Chen was responsible for the hippocampus model I showed you about. Andy Keller and Max Welling did the recurrent network simulations. And Mia Cameron, who she's really amazing. That it's interesting. The beauty of undergraduates is you can give them a problem that is impossible. A lot of other people have tried to work on. They don't know that. And finally, a longtime collaborator, Pat Churchland. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you so much for your awesome talk. I think when Albert Gu and Simon Arora had come here about like a month or two ago, they talked about both the theoretical and empirical, like reduced performance of state space models on like copy/recall tasks compared to transformers. Is there a way of understanding that within the traveling waves?
Well, first of all, let me just say that we want to come up with a theory of the brain, not we're going to be inspired by the transformer. And so the brain, first of all, our brains cannot take in the entire knowledge base of the world, right? we have a relatively narrow bandwidth here, right? And so it may be that the brain approximates what the transformer is doing. Now, specifically with the state space models, it turns out that he doesn't know, Christopher Reed doesn't know that it's a traveling wave. He doesn't know that. And I know because I've talked to his students. They don't know that. They're engineers, right? And they just plugged it in and it works. And so Andy Keller, who came to Telluride Workshop, they got together with another student and they started analyzing. And it turns out that, yeah, you get traveling waves at with different frequencies, temporal frequencies. I mean, this is really, that's the secret. It turns out there are better matrices than the ones, the Hippo matrix that they used, which are actually more efficient for sequences. And I showed you the Mexican hat one, right? So that's turns out to be more efficient. But this is very exploratory right now, and we're trying a lot of things. We're not trying to come up with the best transformer, right? We're trying to come up with something that is inspired by the transformer that we think might be in the brain and is testable, that we can figure out if it's really there.
So in comparing the traveling waves in the model to these phenomena you're seeing in the brain, it seems like the traveling waves in the brain, we're seeing them at a much more macroscopic scale, like in the LFP scale and so forth. Whereas in the model, it's more microscopic, like neuron to neuron kind of traveling wave. And I'm just wondering how you see connecting those. Like,
right.
Do you expect, can we sort of see in the model that we're going to see macroscopic?
Okay, here I think we have to appeal to scaling. And this is a very important principle in deep learning. And as you probably know, back in the 1980s, when Jeff Hinton and I were working on the Boltzmann machine, computers were puny by today's standards. Literally, a megahertz, right, clock. So it really couldn't do very much more than just one layer of hidden units. But what we didn't know was how well it would scale as it gets larger and larger and larger. And the models that I showed you with the recurrent networks that Andy worked on only had 200 units in it. Tiny, tiny, tiny. So what we need to know is we have to scale it up. We have to create a two-dimensional array. Lyle Muller, who actually did the recordings of the human sleep spindles, actually has done that. He has a paper out now in Nature Communications. So he's done two-dimensional waves. So we know it can be done in larger two-dimensional systems. But you're right, it's a scaling problem, and it's really, sparsity turns out to be incredibly important. And it was, we were talking earlier before the meeting that one of the discoveries that Bruno was responsible for studying natural images is that you can represent them with a very sparse basis set. They look like simple cells in the visual cortex. So that was a stellar contribution. And now we think we've seen the same thing for recurrent networks in the hippocampus. And now, this may be a general principle.
Question.
So this is very speculative and probably coming out of my ignorance. So I'm a student who works with mucociliary transport. And we see a lot of these traveling waves, very similar to the dynamics you're talking about here. And I wonder if there is, if I may use that term, a molecular motif which exists for the brain, which might be in some way homologous to motifs which lead to traveling waves in other parts of the organism.
Okay. This is a beautiful question. And Pat Churchland, who is a co-author on a paper, by the way, we have an even more recent paper in Trends in the Neurosciences, which actually is based on the space-time coding, population coding scheme. But in it, she explores that issue. So it turns out that spinal cords are really good at generating traveling waves, right? You have different gates. And that's because you have a network somewhere in your spinal cord that is capable of generating what's called central pattern generator. Cilia are a good example. They're little molecular motors. It turns out that there are many, many examples of molecular traveling waves, calcium traveling waves early in development. This is a general principle. By the way, I'll just give you one example. Carla Schatz was studying, and Marla Feller too, by the way, I think she was a student in any case, who's here, found that if you look at the retina in early development, before even the photoreceptors have matured, you get traveling waves. And they go into the cortex. And it turns out those traveling waves are really important for getting it wired up precisely. The map, topographic map from the retina to the thalamus, the LGN, into the cortex is accurate to 1 part in 10 to the 4th. I mean, that's better than government work, right? Very, very precise. And it's because the traveling wave gives a spatial temporal coherence that is used to wire up the connections with Hebbian learning. And it probably is a general principle in general that you can use traveling waves for that purpose. So yes, this is not just isolated.
The basis understood in the context of the brain.
If it's a basis for the
molecular basis.
Oh, what's the molecular basis? No, the molecular basis is that we have activity that is being generated locally by inputs. But then, because of the long-range horizontal connections, which have time delays in them, that signal transmits and is received by other nearby neurons with this Mexican connectivity. And that is the kernel you need to get a traveling wave. And as I said, it's not all of the neurons that are activated. By the way, this was first seen, I think, in rat barrel cortex. If you stimulate one whisker, you get, just like I showed, you get a kind of a pebble in the pond traveling wave. But it's very sparse in layer 2, 3. So yes, there's a tremendous, overwhelming evidence that there are the traveling waves there, and it's been universally ignored by neuroscientists. Because for neuroscientists, they've only studied the fast patterns of activity in sensory motor coordination. We know a lot about that. We know much, much less about this time band that I'm telling you about, which is in minutes to hours. And I think that the way the traveling wave may play a role in that is at least a place to start looking, right? It's really, there's so much more that needs to be done, but at least it has the beauty of being testable.
I wanted to just briefly give
Sorry to interrupt, but in the interest of time, let's thank Terry again and take the discussion.
Shit.